This is the session on ESXi security and understanding ESXi and the security picture around it. With me is my, let me introduce myself first, Yatin Patil. I'm the product manager for ESXi at VMware. And with me is Kyle Gleed.
Hi, Kyle Glade. I'm on the tech marketing team, so I do all the what's new white papers and hardening guide and things like that.
Welcome again. Before we get into the agenda proper, there is a small disclaimer which I'll give you a minute to read. It just says that anything we talk about that is advanced doesn't necessarily represent a commitment. Okay, let's see what we have today. Before we get into any of the security topics proper surrounding the ESXi hypervisor, we'd just like to set the stage, provide a bit of a refresher on the ESXi architecture, some basic things about ESXi. Again, although we have, with vSphere 5, made the switch over completely to ESXi, there is a large amount of users still there on the previous versions of ESX, which is the one which came with the console OS, the RHEL console OS. So we'll give you a basic understanding of ESXi, how it differs, and then get into the security topics proper, starting with the firewall, users, logging in, authentication to the hypervisor directly, followed by activity monitoring and logging. Okay. So the architectural overview, ESXi, secure by design. Why? Because ESXi has been designed and built from the ground up for one express purpose, which is to be a hypervisor and to host virtual machines, so for the purpose of virtualization. Therefore, ESXi, by its very nature, is small, a small footprint, has only those components in it that provide the virtualization and the support for managing it. ESXi is not an operating system. Unlike other products that started their lives as operating system and can now run virtual machines as well, this is a product that does one thing and does one thing well. And therefore, that allows the hypervisor to be very compact, bare metal hypervisor, no more than a couple of hundred megs in footprint. And as a benefit of that small size, ESXi needs a drastically lower amount of patching as compared to the console OS we used to have in past years. The statistic that is often given out is that 90%, more than 90% of VMware's patching and maintenance overhead was for the console OS. And the console OS was a window into managing the hypervisor where you would plug in your agents and do some management tasks. The console OS did not play any part in the virtualization engine itself. Therefore, the console OS, when it was removed in the ESXi architecture, allowed us to go to a much simpler and leaner architecture, which requires much fewer patching and is therefore simpler and more secure by design. And so, even though it's simple and built for one purpose, ESXi still retains a rich set of APIs to let vSphere and user programs manage it effectively. There are APIs and management frameworks in there to plug in management agents, hardware monitoring agents, SIM providers, and other management infrastructure that you may want to plug in. So it's a full-featured hypervisor, but it's not an operating system. Okay. Let's see now how ESXi is packaged together and put together as a software bundle. And therein we get into topics such as putting together, customizing images, updating, and how that architecture has evolved over time. Kyle?
All right. Thanks, Yatin. All right, so real quick question here. So I'm just curious, show of hands, how many people are still running ESX with the service console? Okay, so it's pretty consistent. So I've been asking that in pretty much every session I've been doing, and I'm finding probably about a third of the people are still running ESX. So it's good to understand what we just went over with regards to the move away from ESX to ESXi is a move towards closer toward security. There's a lot of security built in. One of the things that when I talk to customers, I spend a lot of time talking about upgrades, going from ESX to ESXi as well, moving from older ESXi versions to ESXi. One of the things that comes up quite a bit is around the image, the ESXi image, and the way we package it. And what I find is there's just a lot of people who don't really understand that the security we put in the ESXi starts even before you install it. So the way we package ESXi and way we distribute the ESXi software, there's a lot of security that goes into that as well. So I just want to take a few minutes and talk about this concept of the vSphere installation bundle, or the VIB. So if you look at the ESXi image and you download the image from VMware, you download it as an ISO, or you can download a zip file. The zip file is what we call a software depot, and you can then use that software depot with a product called the Image Builder CLI, which is basically just a set of Power CLI commandlets, to then pick and choose which packages, which VIBs you want to have on your own ISO. So you have the option to customize your ISOs, to add and remove software. You can go out to vendors, you can get vendor VIBs, and you can add them. So there's a lot of capability there, a lot of flexibility there. So when you download the files and you look at it and you kind of break down the image and what it's made up of about 60 separate packages. And for folks who come from the ESXi and the 4.x days, you'll know that when we went from 4.x to 5.0, there's a significant increase in the number of VIBs. That increase in the number of VIBs does not necessarily correlate to an increase in the size of the image, as much as it's just instead of having like 9 VIBs and having a couple of VIBs that are a big consolidation of all the different drivers, what we've done is we broke each driver out into its own VIB. That makes it very easy for you to do updates and things, because if you have an update to a NIC driver, you can just go update that one driver without having to worry about the other drivers that might be packaged with it. So there are about 60 VIBs. If you download the image, you're going to download a file that's about 300 meg in size. If you break that down, you're going to find about 150 meg is for the ESXi itself, and 150 meg is for VMware tools. And so the actual number, I got 60 on the slide here, but the actual number may vary. It could vary depending on whether or not you have any VIBs from your storage vendors or your hardware vendors or other third-party software installed. Just kind of a side note here, one common question I do get is people look at that number, 60, and they think, oh, well, I'm going to use that image builder and I'm going to strip it down to just the bare minimum of what I need. Can I do that? And yes, you can do that. You can go in and remove VIBs that you don't use. But it's really not worth it, and the reason I say it's not worth it because if you take out VMware tools, you have 150 meg. If you strip it down to just the core VIBs, you're only going to save yourself about 6 meg. So these VIBs are very small in size. So you really don't save yourself a lot, so I definitely wouldn't recommend going through that hassle of creating a highly customized image and having to worry about each time a new update comes out, repeat that effort. So you don't really save yourself a lot. As far as what a VIB is, just real quick to kind of understand what a VIB entails, is if you are familiar with Unix, you're familiar with the tarball. Essentially, a VIB is a tarball that's compressed and digitally signed. So the way it works is if you have files you want to install on an ESXi host, you put those in a directory. We call that directory the payload, and that directory basically is relative to where on the ESXi host you're going to install. So if I want to put something in opt, custom drivers and some files in there, I'd go in a directory, opt, custom drivers, put my files. And that's going to be my payload directory. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and create an XML file. We call it descriptor.xml. And in that descriptor.xml, we have a bunch of information that talks about that payload. Things like, can I install these files without rebooting, or do I need to reboot? Is it stateless ready? Does it work with auto deploy? Does it conflict with any VIBs? Does it have any compatibilities or any other requirements? All that stuff is stored in that descriptor.xml. So we take the descriptor.xml, we take the payload, we tar it up and compress it, and then we take and we stamp a digital signature on that, and then that is what a VIB entails. And then we take all these different VIBs, we package them up, and we basically package them into a software depot that you can then use to import Power CLI with the Image Builder. And then you can create what's called an image profile, which an image profile is just basically a logical grouping of VIBs that you're going to install on a host. Okay, so that's just a little bit about the VIBs. It's about a little bit how software is packaged and distributed. From a security standpoint, the thing I want to emphasize is that these VIBs are digitally signed, and so that makes them a little tamper resistant. So when you download software from VMware or from third parties and you're going to install it on your host, those VIBs need to be digitally signed. If you go in and you tamper with it, you're going to invalidate that digital signature. And so basically it's a secure way of distributing the software to help resist, avoid tampering. It helps to ensure the integrity. It's helped to basically instill confidence that the software you're installing on your host has been tested and is supported. Okay, so getting into a little bit more, when you create that image profile, you assign what's referred to as an acceptance level. So there's 4 acceptance levels that you possible. VMware certified, VMware supported, partner supported, and community supported. The thing to keep in mind is if you're using a VMware certified acceptance level, you're basically saying you're only going to allow software to be installed on this host that has been written, developed, tested, and certified by VMware. If you go VMware supported, that means you're going to take software, maybe the software is written by a third party, maybe it's a driver or it's written by somebody else, but it's software that VMware takes in-house and VMware tests it. And so since we test it, we'll support it. And then you have partner supported, which is basically when the partners go out and they write their software that runs on ESXi, they support that, of course. So anything partner supported and above is supported. It's digitally signed, and you can run that with confidence. The one you want to watch out for is community supported. It is possible to go in and create your own custom VIB. Basically go in, like I say, and kind of reverse engineer that VIB and create your own. And you can have a VIB that does not have a digital signature, and that's referred to as a community supported VIB. You want to be careful when you start, if you install those on your host, because what you're doing is you're taking untested, unsupported code and you're installing it on your host. That's going to present a possible security risk. So you'll want to watch that. You'll want to make sure it's coming from a trusted source. You want to make sure you understand the implications of doing that. Once you create an image profile, it's installed, you have that acceptance level. If your acceptance level is set at VMware supported and you try to add some partner VIBs, it won't let you. It will tell you the acceptance level doesn't support this. So you can go in and you can change that using the ESXi command. So here's an example on the bottom there in the black where I've done an ESXi software acceptance get. I'm basically getting the acceptance level. And it's coming back with partner supported. So that basically means I can run any VIBs, I can install any VIBs that are partner supported or above. If I wanted to change that, I could just change that ESXi command to software acceptance set and then set it to a different level. So the way we distribute software, there's a lot of security that goes into it. There's a lot of thought process that goes into how do we make sure that the software we're shipping out, we're distributing, that you're downloading, that you're running, is tested and is supported. And it's, like I say, this is something I find a lot of customers don't really realize about the ESXi image. As you get into ESXi and you use it more and you get into patching and updating, this is something you got to be aware of. And again, the big thing here is just to remember, partner supported and above are all digitally signed. It's all tested, trusted. Community support is what you want to watch for. We really don't have any tools available today to create community supported VIBs, so therefore you don't see a lot of them. But I have seen a few pop up out there, and in addition, you could see the capability being provided in the future wherein we'll give you that capability. And when that happens, you just want to exercise caution when taking those community supported VIBs and adding them onto your ESXi host. Okay, so I've mentioned the ESXi image builder a couple times. So what this is, the ESXi image builder, so I just talked about VIBs, I talked about the image, I talked about how you can basically pick and choose, and your interface to doing all that is PowerCLI. So when you install PowerCLI, it includes a set of commandlets, and we basically refer to these commandlets as the image builder CLI. So you basically go into PowerCLI, you can run an add ESX software depot, point it to the software depot, load it up, then you can basically create new image profiles, you can add and remove packages, and then when you're done, you can export those image profiles out. And you can save them as either an ISO, and you can then use that ISO to basically boot and install your host, or you load that ISO up to Update Manager to do patching, create an upgrade baseline, as well as you can create a zip file. That zip file would be something you could use with, say, auto deploy, or just save that off so that in the future when you want to make changes, you have that zip available. So again, it's part of PowerCLI. We refer to it as the image builder CLI, but really it's just a set of commandlets. It's bundled with PowerCLI. When you install PowerCLI, you get it. So you'll definitely want to make sure you're running PowerCLI 5.1 when you manage the 5.1 software repositories. All right, so with that, that's just a little bit about security of the image and the image profile and how we package software. So now let's go ahead and let's move on to the host itself. So when you install ESXi onto the host, one of the things that was new in 5.0 is we added the ESXi firewall. So we've always had the firewall on ESX, but we did not have it on ESXi. We added that in 5.1. And really, the distinction here is we talk about vShield, we talk about the vShield firewalls and those capabilities. Those are all targeted at protecting virtual machines, controlling access to virtual machines, isolating virtual machines. So when you talk about the vShield family of products, and we're talking about security in that context, we're talking about the VMs. And so really what the ESXi firewall is about is protecting the host itself, and particularly that management network. So by default, when you install ESXi, the firewall is pretty locked down. All non-essential traffic to and from the host is going to be blocked. And that's going to include things like the ESXi shell and SSH. So I know for a lot of folks, they install ESXi, and one of the first things they do is go in and they enable the shell, they enable SSH, and then they turn off the warning. And that's really, they do that because they're coming from an ESX background. They want to be able to SSH to the box because that's what they're accustomed to doing. And you really want to rethink that process when you go to ESXi, because you really should not run your host with those services enabled by default. It's just leaving them open to scans and attacks, and who knows if there might be an SSH vulnerability somebody might discover. So by default, you want to have those services turned off. You can go in and use the firewall to basically start the service and stop the service on an as-needed basis. And when you do enable a service, or you go in and open up a port, and you're basically going to go ahead and open that up because you need temporary access, another thing to keep in mind with the firewall is you can limit it to a specific set of IP addresses. So if I'm going to go in and say I have a KB article that's telling me I need to log on to the ESXi shell to do some things to fix a problem or to accomplish something, I can go in and enable it, but when I enable it, what I might want to do is go ahead and set a specific set of IP addresses that I'm going to allow that access from. So I was talking to somebody who's running vRanger backup, and they were basically saying that it basically uses SSH to connect to the host to do the backup, and they were asking me about this. So in that case, if you're going to enable it, go ahead and limit it to just the IP addresses that the Ranger needs, so that you don't open up to everybody, so you don't basically have it open and exposed to everybody. So the ESXi firewall, it's there to protect the management network. Don't confuse it with the vShield firewalls and those firewalls used as part of the cloud and stuff to isolate your VMs. This is on the host. Every host has their own firewall, and it's secure by default. And you'll want to, if you're going to be opening things up, starting services, you want to make sure you understand why you're doing that. And when we get into a little bit later, we'll actually talk about some timeouts that you can use to kind of help make sure things don't get left on. Now, as far as the firewall configuration goes, it is configurable from the vSphere client, of course, and it's also configurable from the command line, the ESXi command, and it's also configurable from the host profile. So if you're running in an auto-deploy environment where you're running stateless, you can configure it through the host profile. So it's configurable on any of those options, so it's very, very flexible, very customizable. Okay, so I'll turn it back over to Yatin now, who will now talk about some of the shell improvements around user security and local users.
Before we do that, can we open up for any quick questions on the firewall or anything you've seen so far? Is there a question?
Any questions about the firewall?
If not, let's go on to the next section. In this section, I'm going to be talking about interacting with the hypervisor itself, which means logging in with the user account and credentials, interacting with the hypervisor on the shell, and the security aspects connected with that. Now, ESXi, again, oh, is there a question?
That's just SSH, just that port. So you enable SSH, and you can enable port 22, and then you give it the IP ranges, and that's just basically saying anybody who's coming to this box on port 22 has to be in that IP range. Yeah, you deselect the checkbox. It will. I'm pretty sure it will leave the IPs in there. So when you come around and you select it again, you don't have to re-enter. I'm not 100% on that though, but I'm pretty sure that's the case because I tested it. And as I remember, I deselect it, I try and connect, and then I select it, and I try and connect, and I'm pretty sure it retained those IPs.
Another question there? I believe so, yes.
Yeah, I believe it is. I don't have it up here, but I do believe it is. Yeah. Are the ports 902, the key ports, restrictable? Yeah, I believe all of them you can go in and set that IP range. So it's when you select the port, just down at the bottom, you have the option of whether or not you want to restrict it to a set of IPs or not.
Thank you. As I was saying, in this section, I'm going to deal with logging into the system and interacting and the security considerations thereof. Now, ESXi is in marked contrast to classic ESX, which was based on a console OS. ESXi is a single user system. It is not a full-fledged operating system and not meant to be. Therefore, being a single user system, the root account is effectively the only way you can really manage and administer the hypervisor. Now, what happens with an account like root? It's a very well-known name. It's also a very generic account. It's not tied to any particular human being. It is not good policy to keep operating as a root because of various factors. It was not, in past versions, it was not easy to trace administrator activities, or especially if you're coming in as root, to be traced back to the named individuals who are operating. And that is what we're trying to fix. And this is one of the points that where we got some security flack around this point. So operating as root and traceability to named individuals used to be a challenge. The second thing is when root is the only way you can really administer, and if you're coming in over SSH, you have to allow root to come in over SSH. And that, again, does not make for good security. So how are we going to fix this? Let's fast forward to vSphere 5.1, which we announced earlier this week. One notable change there is that if you are a local user account, then if you've been granted admin privilege for that host, you get the same power as a root does, which means you can now operate in your own name using your own account. You don't need to sue. You don't need to operate as root. You can protect that root password, lock it up in an envelope, put it in a safe. Your need to use that root password goes down drastically. And when you're operating in your own name, this and a couple of other logging changes, which I'm about to talk about in a short while, we have significantly improved the auditability and traceability of administrator actions on the ESXi hypervisor back to named individuals. So it's a lot easier. We'll see some examples of this soon. It's a lot easier to trace who came in, when, did what. So dependence on the root account is something that we have fixed with this release. And therefore, now that you have, you're no longer operating as root, one of the things we can let you do safely now is disable root login over SSH. So traceability to named individuals, not being able to SSH in as root, much closer, much better security picture. We are much closer aligned to kind of security policies, practices, best practices that we find in our user base. One point about creating local users. Everything we've said so far, these are about local users, users you create on the system, not the user accounts you create in Virtual Center and login. The creating of local users should be done, or right now can only be done using the legacy vSphere client. This is as of today, cannot be done by the web client. That's a gap we still have, and we will fix that as soon as we can. So the web client, it's important to remember, the web client is not capable of connecting to one host directly. The web client does connect to vCenter. You manage it from there. But if you're going to a single host, one at a time, the old vSphere client, or the C# client as some know it, is still there, and it still works for this purpose. There's one more point of confusion often that we find among our user base, which is the concept of groups on the host. This made sense when we had a console OS, where it was, in fact, a Linux system. We provided the rich user and group primitives and permissions. But on a single user system, the concept of groups is really not there. It's something that's often misunderstood about ESXi. And let me now talk about a few timeouts that we have. The first one, the ESXi shell timeout, is nothing new. Been there for a while, but it's not well understood. So a name like ESXi shell timeout leads some to believe that if I start a shell session and I walk away from it, it's going to time out and kill the shell. No, that's not exactly what it does. In fact, that behavior is actually done by the second one, the interactive shell timeout. So the first one, the shell timeout, controls the timing and activation of the shell and SSH services. Normally, we believe that you should leave these services disabled. If you don't need them, you do not want those extra attack vectors. You don't want those extra vulnerabilities of services running, ports open that you don't expect to use or need. Therefore, what we've provided you is the ability from the vSphere client to go and enable the SSH or shell services. Then you can go in, if you're debugging something or troubleshooting something, go in, do your work, come out, and this timeout, ESXi shell timeout, will time out and disable those services after that set time. So again, not recommended to leave these services running indefinitely. If you don't need them, you can turn them off using this parameter. The second one is new in 5.1, which is basically saying if I start an interactive shell and I walk away and forget it's active, in earlier versions it would stay active indefinitely. And if someone else happens to stumble on it, they have great power to do something bad. It's not something you want to leave unattended. So this timeout is going to time out, disable the shell, and log you out, log out that shell session as soon as it times out. Any questions on these? Yes. Log out the user. Through CLI.
So the question is there a way you can basically automate it so that it will?
It'll only open for a short period of time. Like an application needs to utilize that tool.
Oh, so for example, like that Ranger backup I was talking about, he's going to need to come in every night at 11 o'clock, do a backup. So can I maybe automate it so they'll get turned on at 10:55 and get turned off at 11:30?
Or send out a, hey, I've got an activity I need to do. Send it out.
Yeah, you could script it using, but that would be the only way to do it. One other.
And script it through CLI.
Yeah, you can script it through Power CLI or CLI. You can go in and set those settings. Before I get to your question back there, just one heads up on this. In 5.0, the ESXi shell timeout, there was a bug with it, and it doesn't work. So essentially what it was is if you have the service running and you go in and you enable this timeout, it wouldn't take effect. You'd have to basically stop and start the service because it was on the startup that it reads this timeout. That's actually I seen the fix go through just recently. It will be included in the next update to 5.0. In 5.1, it does work. So if anybody's actually implemented the ESXi shell timeout and found that it was kind of didn't work or it was kind of hit and miss, just be aware that we're aware there was an issue. That issue's been fixed and it'll be out in the next patch. So, yeah, your question back there? We're going to get to that. That's coming up. So he's basically referring to the ESX admins group when you add your host to Active Directory and you use your Active Directory credentials to log on. And we're going to talk about that coming up in the slides. I think there's another question over here. Okay, that was his question.
Okay.
So that's actually a good lead-in because I think that's taken us right up to where we were going with Active Directory. So. Broke the click? Okay, there you go.
That's all right.
Okay, so
A little before we get to Active Directory, let me talk a little bit about lockdown mode. Lockdown mode is not new, has existed for several versions now. Neither has it changed. It's the same behavior since we got it in 4.1. So that behavior continues till today. But why am I talking about lockdown mode here? A, it's not the best understood behavior as to why we have it there and what it's used for. And B, it's to reinforce the message that using lockdown mode makes for good security. Now, lockdown mode is what it says. It locks down the host. If I have valid login credentials to that host, and if I lock it down, I can't get in. Why? This is intended to enforce management of hypervisors through Virtual Center and Virtual Center alone. Therefore, Virtual Center then becomes the single point through which ESX servers are managed. And while good security practices dictate that you manage hosts from one point in Virtual Center, lockdown mode is a way of enforcing that. And therefore, lockdown mode it's something that we find increasingly is required and specified as the de jure means of operations, especially in the federal government or military installations. There's nothing federal or military about it. It is very generic in use. We advise it for general use in other sectors as well. So part of this is education. Part of this is repeating the message. Lockdown mode is meant to enforce a single point of management through Virtual Center, and you go ahead and use it as such.
Well, one quick comment to add to that. So he mentioned that lockdown mode is often misunderstood. And part of the reason why it was misunderstood is because if I go in and I put a host in lockdown mode, I'm basically saying the only way you can manage this host is through vCenter. The problem is root was an exception. You could always log in as root. And because you needed to use root to manage your box, what would happen is people would only access the box as root. So even though you enable lockdown mode, you're still able to log in as root, and it kind of seemed like, well, what's it doing? I can still get to the host using root. So the idea was, lockdown mode prevents non-root users from being able to manage it, and forces you to go through Active Directory. So you go through Active Directory, vCenter. So when you go through vCenter, and where vCenter, you have all your role-based access control, you have all your limits, and you control access to things. So you're basically forcing your users, you're preventing them from taking their vSphere client, connecting to the host directly, and managing it outside of Virtual Center where you've set up all your access controls. So this is for non-root users, and that's one of the areas where the confusion came in, is because people didn't get they'd enable it, then they'd log in as root, and they'd be like, well, that didn't lock it down. I don't get this. So just kind of keep in mind, that's part of the reason why that was a little bit confusing.
And so, lockdown mode. Now, you've locked down your host. They can only be managed through Virtual Center. What happens, if Virtual Center goes down for some reason or becomes unreachable because there's some other networking problem? Normally, there's no way to manage your hosts. They're just off by themselves. So in order to fix that situation, there's two things. Root is always empowered to go in and bring that host out of lockdown mode so you can manage it in that scenario. And now that you don't need to operate as root anymore, you can operate in your own name. How does that play with lockdown? So that what we have, a new property configuration parameter here is a DCUI access list. A DCUI, for those who don't know, stands for Direct Console UI. This is the physical console, the yellow and gray screen on the ESXi box.
Real quick, one point of clarification. We're kind of shifting gears here a little bit because when you enable lockdown mode, you can still log on the DCUI as root. There's also the ability to disable the DCUI. And a lot of people used to run into this situation because you enable lockdown mode, you disable the DCUI, and you can get into a situation where root couldn't log on because you can't log on the DCUI because you've disabled it. So, and you can basically lock yourself out of the box. And so we keep that in mind. When you enable lockdown mode, you're not locking yourself out of the DCUI. That was a separate setting that you would use. So just keep that in mind. So when you enable lockdown mode, you're not disabling the DCUI. What you're doing is you're saying only root can log into the DCUI. Okay. And so now we're going to talk about the DCUI access and some changes there. So go ahead.
The DCUI access, it's a list of users, comma-separated list of valid credentials, valid users, who you authorize and say these guys can come in and bring the host out of lockdown if virtual center is unreachable or crashed, and there's some kind of emergency scenario. So this is your backup plan to get your host back into a manageable state in case virtual center goes down.
One important thing to keep in mind, if you have users listed in the DCUI access and they log in to take it out of lockdown mode, all those users in that list get full admin rights. Yeah. So you don't want to just add anybody to that list, because once they take it out of lockdown mode, they become admin. So you only want to have a handful of accounts of people that should have admin access in the DCU access list.
Correct. And then so talking about admin access, the entire point about logging into ESXi directly is who logs into ESXi directly. It's always admins. It's always admins for the purpose of administration. Administration should normally be done through vCenter. You only want to be at the host if something's wrong, you're trying to troubleshoot it. That's the purpose you want to use this for. It's not for operational use, daily administrative tasks. If you find yourself doing that, it's probably us. We haven't done our jobs fully yet. There's something missing. Any questions on lockdown? How many people knew about lockdown before? Okay.
How many people actually used it?
How many used it?
That's a good number.
Much smaller number. Was this useful? Right. Thank you. Now let's talk about authentication and authentication to Active Directory. ESXi does have an Active Directory stack. You can point an ESXi host to an AD domain controller and authenticate against it. It's standard AD controller, through which you can configure either as adding a computer either with a username, or you can select an authentication proxy if you don't want to store those login credentials. So both modes are supported. So using this, then your local accounts, you don't have to store local passwords. an AD domain controller will authenticate logins to ESX directly.
So where the authentication proxy comes in is with host profiles. So if you're using host profiles and you're adding your host to an Active Directory domain, you bring in a new host, like with auto deploy, for example, which is the new automation capability of running diskless and stateless. You can basically add that information to the host profile. So if a new host boots up, it can be added to Active Directory automatically. In order to do that, you have to provide those Active Directory credentials. If you don't want to store those Active Directory credentials in the host profile, what you can do is set the authentication proxy. And the authentication proxy is included with the vCenter installation ISO. So when you put vCenter in and you run the auto run, you'll see authentication proxy is one of the options there. You can install it. It's a pretty simple install. Installs on a Windows host. Go through, you give it the information it needs to authenticate to Active Directory, and then what it does is it sits there as kind of a mediator. So when a new host boots up and you're using the host profile to configure it, it will basically go to the authentication proxy who will take care of authentication with Active Directory and doing what it needs to do and getting that host in there without having to provide those credentials. So that's kind of, the other option could be in the host profile, you can just go ahead and store the Active Directory user and password that has those privileges. So you have the two options there. The authentication proxy is really kind of seen as the more secure way of doing it.
Thank you. And now talking about Active Directory and Active Directory groups, there is a well-known group called ESX admins. Now, the group, the way it used to be, is that anyone who is a part of the ESX admins group, which is a name that's fixed, not changeable, anyone who's a part of that group automatically got admin privileges on the host. Now, it turns out that was a little too simplistic and inflexible, so we have changed that in 5.1. So you can do two things. You notice the little checkbox here. It says you can disable that behavior completely. So there is no predefined group whose members automatically becomes admins. If you like that, but if you want more control on the name, we give you the ability to change the name. So if it's ESX admins, or it could be finance ESX admins, the host in the finance cluster or the HR cluster, you can now do that based on this. So what used to be a single set-in-stone name, well-known name, again, the security part of it is you don't want well-known names that automatically grant you privileges, not a good security situation. We have allowed you to either disable or change the name that you like.
And this is the question that the gentleman had asked earlier about Active Directory. You know, before we'd assumed ESX admins, if that group existed and you were in the group, you'd get admin rights. There wasn't really anything you can do about it. You just had to know that. So now we're basically giving you the option to change that name or to not make people automatically admin to kind of help close that, make it a little more secure.
So there were two questions. There's one here. Go ahead. Well, they become admins. They become admins on that host.
It depends on that checkbox. If that checkbox is selected and they're part of that group that's specified, they get admin. If you deselect the checkbox, then they don't get admin.
Yeah, but I think his question was, when you come in over SSH, are you still
when you come in over SSH?
If you're an admin, you're an admin.
Yeah.
Even when you come in over SSH. Question? It would work as it did before. So by default, the name is ESX admins. If you have a group like that, and the members of that group would become admins.
Well, you'd have to go out and manually assign privileges. It's not going to automatically make it an admin user. You'd have to go out and manually assign privileges.
Correct.
So by basically, rather than have to go in and create a group and go in and give that group full admin access and then add people to the group, the idea was, okay, we're just going to take ESX admins and you can just put people in there that you want to be admin. And then people... Yes. Yeah, yes, exactly.
Question?
You have to manually create it.
Yeah,
it's not automatically created for you. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to manually create a group called ESX admins, and if you whatever number of users you put in there, those user accounts become.
Yeah, it's not.
We don't automatically create.
Yeah, we don't automatically create the group. Yeah. What was happening is people would go in and they would basically, the Active Directory guys would basically say, oh, these are all my vSphere admins. Oh, I got this ESX admins group. I'll just drop them all in there. And then all of a sudden, they wouldn't realize that you just gave everybody full admin access, and maybe you have sub-admins, and you have different levels of access. And so that was kind of, it was a little subtle there, so we had to kind of account for that.
Right. I mean, the biggest risk here is well-known name, which gives you a lot of powerful credentials. All right, now let's go on to how we have changed or added to the logging that happens on the host and the monitoring. The first thing in this section is about addition of SNMP v3 support.
Yeah, and so really here, over the years, this has been something on people's wish list for a while. Hey, when are you going to add SNMP v3? So a lot of people running SNMP, particularly from a security standpoint, they were aware of their limitations in version 2, version 1. They were looking for version 3 because they knew that it closed a lot of those limitations from a security perspective. So we have finally added SNMP v3 to ESXi. Another change we did is in addition to adding the SNMP, we've actually broke it out. So instead of running as part of the VM kernel, it now runs as a separate agent on the host. That makes it easier to do patching and updating. So we've, from a security perspective, we've upgraded to v3, so you get that SSL, you get the extra authentication, you get the added security. And then from a kind of a patching and updating, just as a side note, we've actually broke it away from running inside the VM kernel to a separate agent, which is going to make it easier to do updates and patches going forward.
Was there a question here? No. Okay. Next, on account of all the user changes that we did, named users, turning off SSH, we've also increased the amount of information logged, and it's, as I said, it's easier to trace back to named individuals. Let us see how. One thing right off the bat, the third bullet, direct console activity used to be all logged with a username DCUI. Again, that was not good because it didn't tell you who it was that was doing all those things. let's see an example of an admin activity on the hypervisor shell. Here's someone who's logged in. This is a test user in our lab, but it could be a named individual. So what you see here is an interactive session going on, commands executed with logs onto when it was, who it was, and what did they do. Whereas what you found here was DC UI in the past, this is now an actual username. So this is auditability tracing back to who did what, and you don't need to SU to root, just operating in your own name. Here's authentication attempts, successful login attempts, unsuccessful login attempts, both of which are captured here in the logs. We didn't fully have this before. And a point about logging, on ESXi, you can log locally, of course. You can also set it to tee those logs to a remote syslog server, in which you could have logs in both places or more than one place. And therefore, you're logging more things. You're naming individuals who are operating. It's much easier to keep tabs on what happened, who did what.
One comment on the logging from a security standpoint, getting back to the change with the ESXi architecture, is you'll need to pay attention to where your logs are located, because it is possible, particularly if you're booting in a diskless configuration or if you're booting off USB or SD, that your logs could reside in var temp, in RAM disk. So basically the way it works, when the host is installed and configured, it tries to create a scratch partition. It takes a 4 gig region on the boot disk where you're installing, creates what's called a scratch partition, and that's used to store the logs. When you're installing in a diskless environment where you don't have local storage, or you're booting off a USB or an SD, we won't put scratch on the USB or SD because logs are an area of high write activity, and we don't want to prematurely wear those devices out. They're very sensitive to high amounts of I/O. So what we'll do in the case that we cannot create a scratch partition is we just put the logs in var temp. From a security standpoint, it's bad because even though you have the logging going on, if you reboot your host, your logs get wiped out, you lose that accountability. You can no longer go to your logs, and not only from a security standpoint, but from a troubleshooting standpoint. So you want to pay attention. You can go in and change the location of your logs, just simply point them to a different data store. You just want to pay attention to where your logs are located. Make sure they're on persistent storage. From a security standpoint, I typically recommend you set up a remote log host and you send them off using syslog to remote log host as well. So there's a couple options there. But just a quick note on the logging, that with ESXi and the architecture, you'll want to make sure your logs are going to persistent data store. It's kind of a best practice and kind of a known issue.
Especially to be taken care of when you have diskless nodes.
Yeah, so anybody here using auto deploy? Kind of a little bit of a tangent here. Everybody know what auto deploy is? All right, so a good number. So yeah, so when you go auto deploy and you go diskless, a lot of these issues become more prevalent because by default your logs are going to be on storage, and most of us have big boot devices. When you go diskless, you have to take into some of these extra steps into account.
Right. So now was there a question? Yes. So the question was, if you just want to see the logs or operate on the logs, is there a way you can get in other than the console? Well, you can come in over the console. If those logs are going to a remote syslog server, you can log into that server and access those logs there. If you don't have a remote syslog server, then you have to be on the host. So in summary, recap, ESXi, very lightweight, purpose-built for virtualization only, but it's also very, very simple hypervisor. It's not an operating system. And the less you treat it like an operating system, and the more you treat it like a thin appliance, the more closely aligned you are with our design principles. We have with 5.1 eliminated dependence on the root account and added traceability back to named users, what they do and how they operate on the host. It is possible to set up local accounts using directory services like Active Directory and the security situation and capabilities of the Active Directory stack also have been improved. Namely, the ESX admins group is no longer a well-known hard-coded name. Monitoring and logging of information has significantly improved in 5.1. Is what's logged and how easy it is to trace back to who did what while they were on the host. And with this, the big picture, we have brought the ESXi security situation and picture and practices much closer in alignment with the security best practices we see in a broad section of our customer base. Things like not being able to SSH in as root, having a shell timeout on inactivity, not being able to use root. These are the things that most security policies, across segments of industries, across several standards we've seen. These are some of the most common elements and issues we used to have with ESXi security. Those are now fixed. Question? I'm sorry? The question is there a security guide, or do you mean a security guide or hardening guide? A hardening guide. Now, the hardening guide for 5.0 was released shortly.
Yeah, we just came out with 5.0. We need to revise it, get it out for 5.1. The plan is, yes, to have one. It's going to take a couple of months to get that out because we've been swamped getting ready for VMworld. So we will get one out for 5.1.
Yes, it's going to be much shorter than the wait you had for the 5.0.
One of the
has to be done.
So how many people use the hardening guide? So essentially, the hardening guide is we had it in 4.0, and in 5.0 we revamped it. And one of the things we did when we revamped it is we converted it over to a spreadsheet format to make it easy for you to. What we found was a lot of customers were taking the Word doc that we sent out or the PDF, and we're spending a lot of time converting it into an Excel so they could basically take out things that weren't relevant to them and then sort and change it. So what we did is we basically now provided it as an Excel document that you can then manipulate. It includes recommendations on securing your ESXi host as well as securing vCenter as well as securing VMs as well. And it just kind of takes some of the known security vulnerabilities, things to look for, VM safe APIs that aren't being used, things of that nature, and how to lock down your host. So the 5.0 version just came out, I think, in August. Or actually, we're in August. It came out in
early summer.
Yeah, early, like
I don't know the exact
May.
date.
I think May. And we will be getting a revision out for 5.1 shortly. Yeah.
So, every time we go to an upgrade or a place where I work, our enterprise security team always asks, how does your guideline conform with the CIS?
Okay, so the question is, hey, we're doing an upgrade. The security guys are getting involved because you're going to a new version. They want to know how do you conform to the CIS, the security standards and stuff. Yeah, that's kind of a, as you see here, we have, historically we've had some challenges because from a security standpoint, hey, you use a shared root account, you got many people using that account, what's your password change policy around that account? And so we're moving towards securing it. So we're closing a lot of those gaps. There's still a few out there, the two-factor authentication and stuff. But we're moving in that direction. We're getting more secure with each release.
So as far as providing them the documentation, the hardening document, which you just released, how to provide that?
Yeah, that's a good point. So he brought up the fact that maybe you can just provide the hardening guide to these folks and they can show them, okay, here's the vulnerabilities, here's what you can do to secure the environment, make sure that these things are in place, and the new hardening guide will include things like making sure that you have named users, you're not using root, make sure you don't have the ESXi shell enabled, make sure SSH is not enabled, and you can show that to them to say, hey, we're closing these gaps, we're taking these steps, and that, yeah, you will go a long way towards helping address those concerns. What was that recent?
No. CIS as in... No, let me check and come back to you. I don't have the answer right now. Okay.
Yeah, so, yeah, right here. Yeah, so the question is, hey, if I implement 5.1, does the 5.0 still apply? Yes. What you'll find is the 5.1 will have additional things added for the new features, but everything in 5.0 is still going to apply to 5.1. There might be one or two exceptions, but I'm pretty sure everything's still going to apply. So go ahead and use the 5.0 for now. When the 5.1 comes out, it will include some additional items to account for some of these new things.
Yeah, and just to set the context, for ESX proper, 5.0 and 5.1 is a very small set of changes and additions. A lot of what happened in vSphere 5.1 is on the management stack and the cloud infrastructure suite. At the ESX layer, the changes were smaller.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I mentioned the hardening guide includes vCenter as well as VMs, and in vCenter there's quite a bit that's new. We have a new web client, we got SSO, we've got a lot going into new vCenter with integration with VCD, so the vCenter section will probably be a little bit more dynamic, but from the ESXi section, pretty much the same.
Question? No, it's actually the other way around. We already authenticate to Active Directory. We do have a product gap where ESXi cannot connect to SSO right now. We're going to fill that gap. But once you connect to SSO, you don't care what's behind it. It could be Active Directory, it could be OpenLDAP, it could be something else potentially in the future.
So the idea is ESXi will authenticate to SSO. SSO can then authenticate to LDAP or to Active Directory or to whatever your authentication source is. So
and it could be more than one authentication source. Several different AD domain controllers, could be another LDAP. It could be a collection of things. You don't care what and how many. The SSO service will just tell you authorized, not authorized. Uses industry standard SAML token. And so the moment we plug that gap and connect to SSO, you technically don't need the direct connection to AD. No, I can't give out a date, but a very known thing. Yes, it's being worked on.
It's a priority.
It's a priority.
It's a priority.
We know this is a gap.
Yeah, back here. There's 2 or 3 logs. Your hosty log, your sys log. There's going to be 2 or 3 different logs that the information will get sent to. When you do the remote logging, I think it puts it all in one log, and it kind of stamps the front of the entry with what log it would be on the host. So, well, like there's a command log where it will log all the commands that you're running. There's another log that will log the failed login attempts. And so, yeah, there are different logs. What's that?
Which one does the commands go to?
I don't know the name of it off the top of my head. So if you go to var log, there's like it's pretty self-evident. You go in there's like a commands log or commands.log or something like that. You cat it and you'll see every user and what commands they've run. And if you run commands, it will just keep appending to that log. Anything else? Okay. Got 2 minutes. Yesterday we did this session in 30 minutes, so today we had to work it out to take a little longer.
Yeah. Paced ourselves pretty good. So, yes, that's a question.
Someone asked earlier about adding, saying you're adding a host to vSphere. At that point, you can change that to?
Yes, you can. Right. So we went through this and found there's a bunch of places where they were implicitly assuming and using a root account. Now, that has changed, but I don't know exactly how it has changed. It could be that the first joining of a host to a virtual center might still require a root credential. So it's something I need to check up and let you know.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever tried to. I just had a habit. Every time I add it, I always use a root. I haven't thought about trying it with a named user now that we got that capability. That's a good point. You should be able to add those hosts to vCenter without having to use a root account. So.
Okay.
All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Pleasure having you.